Hello and welcome to the Gamecraft podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Lasky.
I'm Blake Robbins.
And this is a limited series about the history of the video game business. Episode 4, The Forever Games.
The rise of games as a service and the engagement models necessary for that to happen.
So in the previous episodes, we've traced the evolution of the video game companies as they moved from offline publishers to online services. And that transition from offline to online brought with it all these new success metrics that were better suited to evaluating these online businesses. So we talked about concepts like customer acquisition cost, and with it, retention and churn and average revenue per user, which replaced these old packaged goods norms like crescendo marketing spending, sell-in, sell-through, that we previously used to judge the health and the success of games companies. So we've talked about the first of the new online metrics in the previous episode, this idea of customer acquisition cost versus customer lifetime value. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more in the context of these forever games about that second piece, which is about retention and ultimately about engagement, a concept which really underlies this entire new category of games designed to last for really long periods of time, unlike the video games of the past, which were really consumable and designed to be played, and then you move on to the next one and you buy the next thing.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this episode, especially because this is a topic that you and I have just talked about so many times. We've had this conversation offline for several dozens of hours at this point. And in a lot of ways, this episode highlights, you and I are both investors, and it highlights why we view this category as still investable and why it is such an area ripe for disruption, because so many people view games as this packaged goods industry or hits-driven business where there's a certain lifetime value of, let's say, $60 for the 60 hours of gameplay. You and I both know that has evolved quite a bit over time, but it's super interesting to think about, okay, there are games now that have been around for decades, and what are the characteristics of those games?
And I think that's where we're going to start, which is I really do believe that there are attributes of these forever games. I've really studied them. I've been involved personally in the creation of a couple of them. And I really do think that these things titrate down to 5 key attributes that you could look for in a forever game, whether or not a game has the bone structure essentially to become a forever game. And those 5 things, which I'm just going to say right up front here, and then we can unpack them over the rest of this episode, are balance, community, eventfulness, competition, and player investment. And I think games that have all 5 of those things in certain measure, they don't have to have all 5 of them redlining, but if all 5 of those attributes are present, the chances of the game really lasting over periods of 5, 10, in some cases 15 or 20 years really increases dramatically. And so let's get started and talk a little bit about how that works. I would point everyone who's listening to this podcast to my partner Bill Gurley's blog, Above the Crowd, because he's not only written brilliantly about all kinds of issues of investing and macroeconomics and all kinds of things, but he's really written an incredible piece about the lifetime value metric, and particularly how that metric is misused by people in corporate America, because it does have a tremendous potential for misuse. Seems pretty obvious, right? It's like, you know what your customer acquisition cost is because you're literally spending that money. That money is coming out of your bank account and going to the advertising platform that's basically going to try and acquire customers on your behalf. But on the customer lifetime value side, it's extremely ephemeral. What are you measuring exactly? And what is the lifetime of a new product? It's hard to even know how long a customer is going to be on your game, given just how early you are in the process. It's one thing if you've been running a service for 15 or 20 years, but on launch, really, how do you figure this out? And Bill has laid out in his blog 11 traps that arise from reliance on and improper use of this customer lifetime value metric. All of those 11, and I think they're all worth looking at and studying in some detail, they all boil down to one, and that is, you know your acquisition cost, but you have to guess at the lifetime value of your customer until you have a large enough data set to really do real analysis.
Yeah, and that makes our job as investors especially tricky in gaming, where we're releasing a free-to-play game or we're looking at a free-to-play game, and we have to really guess whether this is a fad or this is actually enduring. And I guess to flip that back, how do you think about estimating or thinking about how high a customer lifetime value can be for a gamer? Because some games, for me, like League of Legends, I've probably spent over $2,000 on League of Legends at this point over out of 7 or 8 years of gameplay. That's a pretty remarkable LTV, given that I don't even think they paid to acquire me as a user. I'm curious how you thought about it or how you think about estimating lifetime value.
So one of the first things I would look at is the retention dynamics, right? And the idea of how many users are around after 30 days, after 60 days, after 90 days, after 180 days. Sometimes that can be a bit of a crutch. And I've heard some games companies, this was a factor at a very well-known mobile and social publisher, where they were very much reliant on a 365-day metric, and they were managing their development teams in the development process, not after launch, but in the development process, to really concentrate on D365 retention. And I think that's mistaken, because I do think that part of this is establishing that habitual play pattern that allows for re-engagement. It's like, yeah, you may lapse for a month, but this is something that's in your head now, and you really appreciate the pleasure that this game brings to a degree that you're willing to come back to it at some point in the future. So I do think that looking at those shorter time period engagement metrics can be quite useful, right, in determining whether a product is capable of re-engagement. The other thing, obviously, is does it have spending hooks that work over the life cycle of the consumer? So early on, you're trying to level up, you're trying to get better, you're trying to get enough experience so that you can play it against higher level players, et cetera. And for that, you're going to be spending on things that may be very different from the kinds of things that you would spend in the elder game portion, where maybe you've been playing the game for a couple of years and you're playing it quite differently than you were playing it in those early years. And so having those hooks in the game so that it can accommodate different styles of play and different styles of paying is quite important in terms of being able to grok the lifetime value of a customer and make a useful estimate about it.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And just to your earlier points, I think a lot of what we're seeing on the mobile side right now of a lot of these studios sort of folding because they knew the customer acquisition costs and they were sort of predicting what the return on ad spend was going to be with IDFA and some of these policy changes. You're seeing all of those equations actually completely fall out of whack, which we talked a little bit about on the last episode. But it is very interesting that they were estimating the lifetime value, and it turns out they were actually very wrong because they didn't know it as precise as they thought, and it's causing a lot of these studios to actually flip upside down.
Yeah, it's interesting because in some sense, it's a new twist on this problem, which is you knew previously if you got this kind of user, right, the kind of whale hunting that we talked about in the previous episode, if you could target those whales successfully, you kind of had an idea of what they were capable of spending. And now where you cannot target those whales as successfully as you could before, and therefore you're getting more of a random sampling of potential users, you're having to change your lifetime value calculation to accommodate for the fact that you're not getting that super concentrated group. And instead, you're getting a more diverse group who may not necessarily be spending with the same pattern that those previous consumers were spending. And so again, not only does it affect your willingness to spend for those consumers, but it also affects the lifetime value that those customers can potentially generate. And it really turns some of these models very much upside down because as we talked about in the last episode, there are quite a number of mobile game companies out there that are running their models very close to the bone in terms of how much they're capable of spending versus what a profitable customer looks like.
I guess maybe taking a step back, you touched on something around having a great play pattern or having an enduring play pattern is sort of key to all this. How should we think about historically how that's played out in games?
Well, it's really interesting that you ask because one of the things that I think people really underestimate about games, and I think it's a byproduct by and large of the fact that we've grown up in the video game business. And the video game business, because of its business model, which was very much targeted toward sending you into stores to buy things, bring them home and play them, and then go back to the store and buy a new thing. That consumption pattern, that planned obsolescence, if you will, of video games really perverts our idea of what a game could be. Because if you really look historically, most of the dominant play patterns in human history have ludicrously long lifespans. I mean, you know, there's a historian and archivist at the British Museum who studies games and has also an expert on Sumerian culture. And recently, they've unearthed a game in the ruins of ancient Sumer we are calling the Royal Game of Ur. It's a game that was played throughout the Near East for something like 3,500 years. It's literally still being played in some form among some communities in South India today. It's like
Wow.
3,500-year-old game, basically. They found sort of ancient Egyptian game that's very similar to cribbage. It's like a racing game, if you will, where you're moving a peg on a board that's like 3,000 years old. Obviously, that play pattern endures to this day. You can go and buy a Hasbro version of it at a toy store. So backgammon may be even older than that Egyptian cribbage game, and it's still being played pretty much the same way today that it's been played historically. Go has been played in Japan and in East Asia for 2,500 years. Chess is probably 1,500 years old. It's hard to imagine, but you could really have sat down with Leonardo da Vinci and played a credible game of chess. Maybe you'd have to teach him a couple of rules. Castling, I think, is probably a new invention. But other than that, it's pretty much the same as it's been. Even our modern examples, right? Like whist, which we think of as contract bridge, is probably 400 years old. Poker is about a 150-year-old play pattern. These are really, really long duration play patterns which persist. And again, they have a lot of these attributes of the forever games that we mentioned at the beginning, right? They're super balanced. They're super competitive. Obviously, eventfulness has been built around them. Community has been built around them. There's a chess community. There's a backgammon community, for that matter. And I think all of these things contribute to their persistence. But again, I think we in the video game business have a very distorted view of how long a game can really last if it's well designed.
Yeah, and part of me thinks that that's because the early days of video games were far more centered around the packaged good model, right? We are finally in this era of let's think about multiplayer games. Let's think about enduring free-to-play games. I imagine that has to play a role in why our view on games as forever games is perverted, because poker, in theory, in my mind, is not going to go away for the next thousands of years, right? Like now that we have card games out, it's hard to imagine card games ever disappearing.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it's part of the reason we're doing this podcast, which is that the business model influences the content. And I think we've seen that in this case, right? Where the business model of the packaged goods era encouraged this kind of cyclical consumption where you went and bought FIFA every year. You went and bought the sequel to the game that you were playing, Fallout 1, Fallout 2, etc. That was necessitated by the economics of the video game business, and therefore the games were designed with that in mind. Whether they were designed explicitly with that in mind or whether it was subtly with that in mind, it was still in there. And I think that's changed very dramatically in the modern era of the forever game. And we have the internet in large part to thank for that. Because as the internet came in with internet-related business models, as we discussed, these online business models of retention and churn and other things like that, we're managing to a different kind of a business. And while we're managing to that business, we need games that are amenable to that business, and hence the forever game.
Yeah, for this episode, I think it's actually really helpful to talk about sort of those games that have become forever games or have emerged or broken through that. And so I think maybe even just talking about what are some examples of games that even from that era of the packaged good era that have endured.
You know, it's interesting. And again, part of the problem was also that in the absence of the internet, a lot of the play patterns that persisted were single player because there was really no ability to play multiplayer. In fact, it was the console games that had single screen multiplayer, right? Mostly sports games, frankly, where you could play NHL game or you could play FIFA or you could play Madden or something like that on a single screen with your friend with two controllers. Those play patterns have stayed pretty static for more or less the last 20, 30 years, where those games are mostly the same as they've been. Obviously, they're much better. They're much richer. They're much more detailed. They're much more complicated. But in a lot of ways, it's the same play pattern. You're sitting on the couch side by side. You have a controller in your hand and you're playing one on defense, one on offense. Very simple. I think that's a play pattern that remained from that early era of packaged goods, and I think it's an important one. Another one that's kind of curious, right, is Tetris. I had the Tetris license when I was in the mobile game business and made a lot of money selling Tetris again in the early 2000s. Tetris was a game that was invented in Russia in the mid-1980s, and it was ported to probably every hardware platform that's ever been created. I mean, you could play Tetris on anything. It sold tens of millions of units. It's a huge business. And I think it's just one of those things. It's almost like a brain virus. It just gets into your head, that repetitive, stressful kind of play pattern. And I think it leads us to that first attribute of the forever game, right? Which is balance and flow, because Tetris has like a perfect balance and flow. You have just enough time to make your rotations and to move the pieces on the grid in a way where you can sort of slot them in. And it ramps in difficulty in a very, very sensible way. And it produces a kind of anxiety and bliss state that is just perfectly balanced for that concept of flow. I think there's a lot to learn from games like Tetris, sort of in the micro. But again, Tetris had various limitations, particularly the fact that you're really just competing against your previous high score, which, while compelling, is not as compelling as competing against a human.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Tetris, it's Minesweeper, it's even, in the last episode we talked about Snake. Like, there are some of these early single player patterns that did endure, and still you can find thousands of clones, or you can play any of those for free all over right now. But I think for you and I, where it gets really interesting is where multiplayer starts to emerge.
Absolutely. Going back a little to the console conversation, I think the other play pattern, and it's one that I think is interesting because we haven't seen it necessarily in its modern form as frequently as I might have guessed we would, which is the fighting game or the martial arts game, right? The Tekken, the Street Fighter, which were incredibly important play patterns during the console era. And maybe we'll come back and talk about them a little bit during our console episode. But at this point, I think it is useful to point them out because they have a lot of attributes of the sports game.
Yes.
And they were a really interesting play pattern. And I wouldn't be surprised to see those things reemerge in some form as we go forward, because they do have some attributes that would make them amenable to the kinds of competitive gaming environments that we see really dominating in our modern business.
Completely agree. And I think those were very clear evolutions from sort of the box arcade era as well, where you would sit and play Street Fighter or one of those games on a boxed unit, and then you go to console, and that's a natural evolution. It feels like we haven't reached a point where there is true online multiplayer. It's probably latency or something.
It's probably latency has a lot to do with it. I think.
That plays into it, but it is super interesting to think about. It is going to happen. That is a play pattern that you and I both know really does endure.
When I was making, first-person shooters back in the late 90s, people said the same thing about first-person shooters, right? Like, oh, we'll never be able to do first-person shooters successfully online because of the latency. And we figured it out, partly through design and partly through the evolution of technology. It's now much more pleasant and viable to play, multiplayer shooters online than it's ever been. And I could see that same thing occurring in the Street Fighter genre. But, going back to your initial question, which was sort of, how did we make this transition into multiplayer? I really think that it was the MUDs that got us there, right? The multi-user dungeons from the PC era. And really, those things in many ways go back all the way to the 1970s. They almost arose kind of at the same time as computer networking itself, which, again, shows you that people want to play games, right? People invent computers, they invent computer networks, and the next thing they do is make games for them. And MUDs were a real example of that. And so the multi-user dungeons were typically in those days text-based. If you've ever played like the Zork games from Infocom, now Activision, you would be very familiar with this concept of you're at a house, turn left, go east, whatever, like the text commands. As the MUDs evolved through the 80s and into the 1990s, there was the rise of a play pattern that I think is one of the most important in the history of video gaming, and that is the DICU MUD. The DICU MUD was invented in Copenhagen in 1990, and it's really, I would say, the least understood and the most persistent of the multiplayer gameplay patterns. It's the hack and slash, inventory, exploration, role-playing game, which, like I said, persists all the way to today. So, we've seen 32 years now of evolution of that play pattern. And again, very few people recognize its origins, but that's really where it came from, right? It came from early MUDs. And It's actually the code base for the DICU MUD has showed up from time to time in popular modern games, which is, again, quite remarkable.
You and I have talked about DICU MUD before. I've never played with that. I was probably an infant when that initially came out. And I've looked into it since, and I'm like, wow, this is a really interesting play pattern, but it's hard for me to imagine ever playing a text-based game. But you can, when you experiment with it or when you observe it, you can see those clear through lines in the games that we play today.
You saw kind of one of the earlier expressions of this, of the MUD, and really one of the earlier attempt to turn it graphical and make it online in a game called Island of Kesmai. This was back in the mid-'80s. There was a group of people in Charlottesville, Virginia, of all places, who created this online, massively multiplayer video game, basically. It's like the first of the MMOs. I'd call it sort of a proto-MMO because it wasn't particularly massive, but it was multiplayer. And it was made again by this tiny company in Charlottesville. And it was a fantasy role-playing dungeon crawl, right? A graphical mud, if you will. And it was actually quite popular for its day. And it had, unfortunately, a business model, that, again, limitations of business model coming back to haunt us, that were really brought from the fact that it was part of these dial-up internet services in the mid-'80s, which were incredibly expensive. So, I mean, you were paying for CompuServe or AOL or some of these other services, Genie, that were hosting these games, $6 an hour for a low-speed connection and $12 an hour for a high-speed connection. You know, you think at the time even, which we would now consider outrageous, you were paying $1 an hour for the $60 for 60 hours of gameplay paradigm that dominated during the packaged goods era, right? So you take that and you multiply that by 6 or 10 or 12 in order to get to what it costs to play Island of Kesmai on an hourly basis. But despite the fact that it was clunky and slow and buggy and horrible latency, because these early dial-up networks, we weren't talking, today we were talking about, I mean, I have a 1 ping on my home network right now, right, yeah, with fiber. In those days, you were talking about 1 second, not 1 millisecond. I mean, we're talking about 3 orders of magnitude difference in latency between where we are today and where we were back then. So, I mean, this was horrible by today's standards, right? And yet, people played it. And why did they play it? Because it had these attributes of community, of competition, of eventfulness, and we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but it was a forever game in prototypical form.
Was Island Kesmai technically like one of the first online games? Like, because again, up until this point, and this is mid 1980s, you really are playing, Pong or these other things. Maybe you're going to the local arcade. This feels like sort of that first unlock of, hey, you're paying this money, but the reason why you're paying this money is you're finally playing with other users on the internet.
Yeah, it wasn't the first, but it was really one of the first attempts to kind of popularize it, right? And you look at the MUDs, they existed in the 1970s, but you were playing them on a teletype, essentially, right? I mean, like you were looking at printouts.
Yep.
So you kind of needed that evolution of a viable online service that was kind of mass market, like AOL, like CompuServe, right? In order to kind of get enough people online and out of a university context where most of these MUDs were developed. So again, while not the first, I think it was one of the first to really popularize it. It was certainly one of the first that came up on my radar screen when I was growing up in the business. It wasn't particularly deep as a game. It was dynamic. And I think that was really important. Did it have state-of-the-art graphics? No. I mean, it had what today we would even think is kind of pathetic for 8-bit. It was not particularly good, but it worked. And it worked because it solved that problem that people had with the games of the day, which was it brought people together online. It was a true multiplayer game, and not in the sense of you and your friends sitting on the couch playing Madden, but in the sense of a community of users that were all getting together for a common purpose. And I remember talking to the Island of Kesmai developers later on when I was in the business in the early 90s and talking to them about some of their early experiences with the game. And I was like, when did you know that it was working? And they would say to me, oh, we knew it was working when we would go in at 4:00 in the morning in God mode, and we would see 10 people in a room at 4:00 in the morning, and we would go in and see what they were doing, and they were sharing chocolate chip cookie recipes. And then a dragon would come into one of the dungeon rooms that they were in, and one or more of them would say, oh, we'll go and dispatch the dragon, and they would go and kill the dragon, and then they would come back and talk about cookie recipes. And again, they weren't there for the gameplay. They were there for the community.
It's funny because so many people talk about games today primarily through the play pattern itself. But I think a lot of people do misunderstand that community is such a huge part of this. I play League of Legends with my friends, and for me, that's where I go and hang out with my friends on the internet. And I imagine in that time, it had to be really magical because that's one of the first times that they are really hanging out and meeting new people on the internet that have similar interests.
Yeah.
Finding nerds at that time, I can't imagine was that easy.
No, it wasn't. And we take that for granted, really. It was a lot harder and a lot more isolated to be a nerd back in the 80s than it was today. And sure, like you said, today it wouldn't be that weird to think that you could ultimately get married to somebody who you met online. But when in the 80s, when people were meeting in games like Island of Kesmai and getting married, it was a big deal. That was like a really weird and, it was newsworthy.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the 1980s, which is just incredible because like I didn't start using the internet until I don't know 1998 or something like that, and so this is really early in all of this.
Yeah, no, this is crackly modem time, right? This is 2800 baud for those older people listening. So when I was at Disney, in the early 90s, it was a really interesting time. Clearly, digital was on the horizon, and there was an interesting thinker there named Bran Farron who was encouraging the Disney staff to think about digital in a really holistic way. Like, he encouraged, even back then, and this was the early 90s, to digitize all the Disney characters so that they could be used in video games and in online services and all these other things. Really ahead of his time, Bran Farron, in terms of how he was thinking about the future of the Disney brands. And I was a lawyer at the time, and they assigned me early on to do things like look and see if they had the rights to put some of their older movies on DVD, because we had to like digitize the Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra from Fantasia and put it on a DVD. And frankly, we didn't have the rights to do that at the time. And we had to go back to find the estate of Eugene Ormandy to get them to assign us the digital rights. And it changed the way we negotiated contracts, because we had to think about a future in which we needed to be able to put this intellectual property on all forms of media, regardless. Again, lots of really interesting changes at foot and very invisible to the outside world, but very important inside of the Disney organization. We were talking a lot internally, the people there who really knew a lot about advanced technology, people from the Imagineering group, people from Disney Television, and from some of these other parts of the company. And there was a little group of us who spent time talking about the future. And I was convinced from spending time with those people that this was going to be the future, that these online services were going to work. So I put together a proposal about building an online theme park. 1992, 1993, went to my boss's boss at the time, Larry Murphy, who was running the strategic planning department at Disney, and pitched him this idea of building a digital theme park. And he sort of patted me on the head and, was like, yeah, that's kind of clever or whatever, and said no. But I really had this kind of bug in my head. So I quit and found a friend of mine who had worked at Sony in video gaming, but who had come from the MIT Media Lab, where in those early days, the Media Lab really only got started. Now it's an institution, but in those days, it had just graduated its first couple of classes. And she and I got together and spec'd out this idea to create a massively multiplayer online gaming company. We went to the US military, actually, which was one of the few places where the technology existed to play massively multiplayer games, because they were building simulations, which they had the ARPANET back in those days. They had an idea where they had a protocol that if you supported, you could plug into a network. And there was actually a convention in Albuquerque, New Mexico, called IATSEC that I used to go to. And they would hold these simulations on the show floor where people would bring their flight simulators and they would bring their tank simulators and all these other combat simulators, and everybody would plug into the same network and you could play. And it really excited my imagination, because I could imagine a future. I mean, you think about it now, it's World of Tanks.
Yep.
But the technology was so bloated, as you can imagine, right? I mean, these are the people who brought us $1,000 screws for toilets. I mean, these people have no concept of like running on consumer hardware. And so I did my best. I went out, I tried to raise money for it. I raised a little bit of money for it, a little seed money, but I couldn't really get it off the ground. But I went and pitched everybody in the industry this idea. And it was really funny, because one of the people who I got the most play from was Rich Hilleman at Electronic Arts.
Wow.
He really wanted to spend a bunch of time with me. And those of you who know Rich, he is an absolute legend. This is the Gandalf of video game design. I mean, this guy is fucking unbelievable. And back in those days, it was just a real honor to get to pitch him. And he was incredibly patient with me. And he asked me all kinds of really interesting questions that suggested he'd really been thinking a ton about this idea of the massively multiplayer online game. And he passed like everybody else did, and I ended up going to Activision and having an interesting career there after I abandoned my fantasy of making an MMO. But Rich, little did I know, had been working with Richard Garriott, another of the great legends, because they had just greenlit Garriott's Origin Systems down in Austin, Texas, to make a game called Ultima Online.
That's an incredible story. It's funny because you had a glimpse of potentially joining EA in theory instead of going to Activision as well. But talk about some legends at that time, and also the foresight. Credit to you that you were thinking about building a digital amusement park, in 1992 for Disney. That's incredible.
It seemed obvious to me, but it seemed kind of batshit crazy to almost everybody else.
I mean, for what it's worth, it's still 2022, and we still don't really have the digital amusement park from Disney. So
we're working on it, but you're right. But Gary, I want to get back to Garriott because I've had the pleasure of meeting Garriott in person multiple times in my career. I had an incredible dinner with him in Dallas. SMU used to have a conference, the Guildhall Conference, and I've been privileged to speak at that conference on a couple of occasions. And on one occasion, Garriott was also there as a speaker, and we had a dinner where we got together. And he had literally just come back from spending 10 days on the International Space Station.
What?
Where he was a space tourist. Little known fact, but Garriott's father was an astronaut.
Huh.
And he showed me video that he had smuggled a camera into the Soyuz rocket that he had blasted off from Star City in Russia. And he took film from the cockpit, essentially, from the capsule during his blast off into space. It was really compelling. I mean, he is one of the true characters of the video game business and really an unbelievably interesting person. But he had formed Origin back in the early 1980s. And he'd had a hit with a series of these high-adventure fantasy role-playing games called Ultima. They'd made 3, 4, 5 of them starting in the Apple II era, and they were very popular. And so the characters derived from the Ultima series were well known to the core gamers. And so they had this idea of taking this intellectual property from the Ultima series and turning it into a massively multiplayer, persistent online game. They spent a couple years in development. They brought in Ralph Koster, who is a brilliant game designer. Again, another legend of the business, somebody who's gone on to be involved in a number of really important projects over the years and one of the most important thinkers really in the video game business to this day. So you had this collection of really clever people in Austin working on this project. And in 1997, they bring it to market as Ultima Online.
You and I have talked a lot about Ultima Online offline before, no pun intended. But you and I have talked about this quite a bit. And you often say Ultima Online is one of the most impactful games in the entire industry. Help unpack what that actually even means, because I never played Ultima Online, but I know for a fact that we still see the ripple effects and lessons from Ultima Online throughout all of gaming today.
You could really start to see what we now think of as the massively multiplayer online game. And it had persistence, like I said. It had, you played a role, so you were a character in this world. There were cities, there was property, there was land, there were castles and homes, there were businesses, there were all kinds. It was a living, breathing community. And the importance of that cannot be overstated. I mean, it's nothing like this existed before. And not only did this now exist, but it existed in a really playable and fun form. It attracted a really significant audience at a time when, like we've discussed, the infrastructure to support a game like this, the internet and all the other various attributes that were necessary to make a game like this, were really poor. I mean, you think about the design considerations that were necessary to pull off a game like this at the time, and it's absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, not only were there network and computational constraints, but the player behavior in a virtual world was completely unknown and unpredictable. No one knew how people were going to behave as characters in an online world. And frankly, some of that behavior turned out to be utterly malicious. And so you needed to invent government inside of the world, right? You had to have policing. You had to have all kinds of other things that one would have never imagined that one would need in a video game before. And so the achievement of Ultima Online and its persistence, it's still playable today.
Wow.
They just celebrated their anniversary very recently. I think their 25th anniversary. The fact that it's still playable today is absolutely remarkable and a testament to how much they got right in that first instance of the MMO.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly amazing just how much they got right. And, you're touching on some really critical parts, which is they created this online world. And up until this point, video games that we know them as were almost movie-esque in that you put them on like guide rails or guardrails of saying, here's what you can do. When you introduce several players into the same world, it's unbounded. And you and I obviously know how the internet plays out and what happens when you put strangers together in a room. Some really weird stuff happens, but I can't even imagine how you built or planned for that in
Oh,
Ultima.
the emergent behaviors and the exploits that arose inside of Ultima Online were absolutely incredible, right? I mean, you had at one point a bunch of people role-playing as carpenters in the world with the skills of carpenters laid a totally airtight siege to a major city in the world of Ultima by using indestructible furniture. They basically created indestructible furniture, and they used it to basically, like, again, lay siege and command tribute from a city inside of this world. So, I mean, that's an emergent behavior that was absolutely and completely unpredictable to the original developers. And really, this concept of the entity that is the world of Ultima getting away from its developers is one of the most important and interesting concepts that really arose and really informed where this internet gaming thing would go over the next couple of decades. There's no more important or dramatic example of this than the assassination of Lord British. To those of people who were around in those days, they'll remember this because it was national news when it occurred because it was so weird. But for those of you who weren't, let me try and explain to you what happened. So you had this character, Lord British, which was a very important character in the Ultima single-player series. So in the adventure games, the monarch of the realm was Lord British. So he would appear in cutscenes and other things like that and sort of, bestow things upon you, et cetera, et cetera. But he was a well-known character. And in the Ultima Online game, Lord British was played by Garriott himself, by Richard Garriott. He inhabited the avatar of Lord British. And so he would appear in-game as Lord British. And he was thought to be invulnerable. He was thought to be completely unkillable. And he was thought to be the most powerful character in the game, essentially an embodiment of God mode, right, if you will. During the beta testing of UO, Lord British, Garriott, was going from town to town giving celebratory speeches about the impending launch of the game, the commercial launch of the game. And essentially he was doing this because they needed to figure out how to load test the servers in those days. And so by getting this celebrity, Lord British, to show up in the towns, they figured they'd get everybody online together and they could load test the servers. So this was going on, and he comes into one town to give a speech, and a rogue player figures out a way to kill him. No one thought that this was possible. And there's all kinds of theories about how it happened and who left the barn door open or whatever. And you could go and explore this lore if you want to. It's sort of beyond the scope of this conversation. But just the fact that he was attacked by a rogue player and killed in the game, something that the developers themselves did not believe possible, was a really important symbolic event in the history of online gaming, I think. And it became kind of a cause célèbre in the video game business. It was because it was so weird and so amusing that the developer of the game was assassinated in his own creation. That there was a certain kind of pop culture resonance to it. But again, I think it was a brief glimpse of the future. And I think that's why it's so important and so interesting to think about, which is that we really saw the game get away from its designers. Something happened that neither the staff at Origin nor the players of the game itself really thought was even possible. Even the assassin didn't really believe he could pull it off. And not only did a player change the canonical narrative of the game by committing this act, which is kind of crazy in and of itself, but the subsequent banning of the assassin, right, ended up raising a whole ethical concern about whether or not that was fair and whether they were being punitive. It was really an early example of kind of how you had to have a sense of moderation, of governance, of ethics even, when you were designing these online worlds. And again, I think we got a really interesting view of the future because over the intervening period of time, those concerns have become really important.
I absolutely love that story for so many reasons, but I think it really does highlight that community is such a critical part of this. And even you talk about the backlash, or I imagine forums were going crazy of trying to figure out what happened and playing a role of should that person actually be banned. Those behaviors, or those emergent behaviors, are everywhere now in gaming. And you think about, let's use League of Legends or Overwatch or FIFA, when they make a decision from the highest level of, oh, we're releasing a new character, or we buffed or nerfed a certain character, we still see those reactions. And it's a perfect example of how the games do run away from themselves. And they're living, breathing creatures in a lot of ways that the community itself helps shape. And a lot of people still don't really understand that that's such a critical part of games.
And again, it kind of talks to this concept that games evolve over time, and that what is fixed at that initial moment of expression is not necessarily what the game is. As you allude to in the context of some of these competitive games, you and I have talked about this before. I'm a Age of Empires player, and Age of Empires 4 has recently been released, and every few months they've been patching and competitively rebalancing it. So they've been increasing certain character traits, certain unit traits by tiny amounts and diminishing others. And it changes the nature of the game. It changes the whole meta. Everybody comes back onto YouTube and starts reposting videos. It's like everything's changed upside down. You can no longer play this civilization the way you used to, et cetera. And again, it suggests that these things are living, breathing, dynamic entities. They're not just fixed at that initial moment of expression and then they just run their course, right? They're capable of evolving, and they're capable of evolving in response to the user's exploration.
Yeah, and I think it's people who play these games, in a lot of ways, their agency is manipulated to be, they are those characters, or they are these people. And so when there are changes or when there are decisions made from a higher level, let's say from the God mode, they feel that implicitly. And they're like, no, you just mess with my society that I live and breathe. And that's why you have community be such a big part of these games, because they are spending all of their time in these worlds. And obviously when decisions are made, they want to be involved in it. And very similar to a democracy, you want to be able to vote and voice when something bad happens.
Absolutely. What you're getting at is really the essence of it, right? Which is that community is about human relationships. When you're introducing community into a game, you're introducing human relationships into that game in all of their forms. Some good, some not so good. I think that's just critical, and it's very subtle, and it's very difficult to plan for. And I think it's useful for people who are thinking about this today to really go back and look at some of these antecedents, because all of the problems that you're facing today have been faced in the past because they're human problems. They're not technological problems. They're not necessarily, we haven't solved those problems by getting a better internet, by getting more communications tools, et cetera, et cetera. No, they're human problems, and they're going to require human solutions. And those are solutions typically about design. And I think it's an important and interesting lesson. And again, you think about human problems, one of the most important of human problems is trade. I think one of the cool things about Ultima that we didn't really address but is worth really talking about is their economy.
Ultima's economy and all of these community pieces feel like still what we're talking about today, which is obviously crypto and Web3 and these things of how important virtual economies are becoming and governance and all those pieces. You and I have talked quite a bit about Ultima's economy offline, but I'm excited to hear your perspective on why it was so important at that time.
Well, you think about it, in a lot of these things that we've been discussing, the rise of virtual goods to supplant the idea of the packaged goods, the idea of, free to play even, all of these things really kind of stem from the existence of these virtual economies. There has to be some kind of an economic value system that would encourage a player to, let's say, invest in virtual goods, because those goods would then become useful within the context of the game. That's an economic decision, right? And it's a designed and planned economy. And of course, like all designed and planned economies, it'll go off the rails because people will not behave the way you expect them to behave. So almost immediately after Ultima launched, despite their effort to kind of control the economy in a walled garden like everybody tries to do when they make these games, items from the game started popping up for sale on things like eBay, which was a brand new auction site that had pretty much launched at the same time as Ultima. You were seeing powered up swords going for hundreds of dollars. In-world real estate was being sold for thousands of dollars. Gold farming for profit, which is something, we've seen evolve over the last 20 years, started to happen, and people started to make real money from their play, which was never possible before.
And just so I understand, Ultima wasn't a free-to-play game at that time, right?
No, Ultima was a subscription game.
Wow.
And it was a $60 boxed product. You had to buy a $60 boxed product because, again, we're still squarely in the age of the packaged good. And then you had to pay on top of the $60 initial purchase a monthly subscription fee in order to play it. So it was a really expensive proposition. Again, even with that, people were willing to go outside of the boundaries of the game and buy virtual goods. even though the developers of the game wouldn't have designed them into the game. It's like the rare item economy that Origin created inside of the game almost as kind of a jackpot, like loot box type concept where you would periodically have rare items introduced into the game and they would become incredibly coveted. Those things, in some sense, are a direct line to the modern world because the developers of Cartrider, a game we talked about in previous episodes, the Korean game that really introduced the concept of free-to-play with virtual goods being its core business model, those developers studied Ultima Online and in particular the rare economy, the rare item economy within Ultima Online. I've had this conversation with Raf Koster. He says it was explicit. They called him up to discuss this with him when they were creating Cartrider. They literally called him up to get some insight into how the rare item economy within Ultima Online evolved because they knew it was critical to understand in order to build this really first example of the free-to-play virtual goods game.
It's interesting to think about it if we go back to the beginning of this conversation or this episode, where we're talking about lifetime value. And in this case, Ultima is not actually capturing the lifetime value of these secondary transactions that are happening for these virtual goods. But you can argue that Cartrider maybe had that insight of, wow, there is a thriving economy here that we should capture. And maybe that's how they actually get inspiration of what is the lifetime value of and get conviction around doing the free-to-play path, because you're seeing these transactions happen on eBay for Ultima items and you're like, wait, that alone is valuable. We should just be doing free-to-play. Why are we ever doing the $60 game in box goods side?
Yeah, it's interesting. The packaged goods publishers in particular have had a very hard transition to this because they were so used to exercising this control over what happened in the game. And they viewed this not in the way you're describing it, which is like, this is an opportunity to increase our lifetime value of our customers, right? If we created a marketplace and we allowed them to trade these items legitimately and legally, as opposed to illegally and illegitimately through online auction sites like eBay, where all that value is now accruing to eBay, who's charging all of the transaction fees, et cetera, and they're the one capturing the value for these transactions instead of the publisher. But again, it was a philosophical problem, right? They just couldn't overcome that idea that they had to give up control in order to achieve a higher level of monetization. And that didn't really happen for many, many years after Ultima. I mean, it took 7-8 years after Ultima, and really it took those ideas going to Asia and then coming back to the United States before they really, really caught on.
So Ultima seemingly is a massive success at that time. Do we immediately see more MMOs emerge, or what happens after Ultima starts to reach some level of success at that time?
I would say that Ultima was more of a success inside of the games business than it was necessarily a huge commercial success. I mean, it did very well. It probably peaked at maybe 100,000, maybe a couple 100,000 subscribers. And that's still meaningful, but nothing by today's standards of success. So I think it did well. I think it probably returned its investment to Electronic Arts multiple times over, but really it was its impact inside of the games business that was almost more important than its commercial impact. So yeah, as you said, we saw a bunch of stuff start to come out in the late 90s, early 2000s. You had Lineage in 1998 in Asia, which got to a success that Ultima could have only dreamed of, right? I mean, Lineage got to about 3 million players at its peak, which was really significant back in that era. You had Sony Online greenlight Variant's EverQuest down in San Diego, and that came out in 1999. Their innovation was more 3D graphics because Ultima was kind of still an isometric 2D game. So they brought some of these technologies from the first-person shooter, right? Third-person 3D, and they brought that into this online role-playing concept. And so that started to happen. You had Asheron's Call from Turbine in Boston. They came out in 2000, and they took that 3D idea and created more of a seamless, continuous world that you could explore. So it wasn't as bounded and as kind of discrete as Asheron's Call or even as Ultima Online before it. And one of the things they introduced, which is a really important concept in the modern understanding of the forever game, was this idea of eventfulness. They had built these, there had always been in Ultima these user-generated community events, essentially. And there were some that were kind of lame, that were sort of brought by the developers. They would have these sort of festivals or other things like that were these sort of early and slightly pathetic attempts at re-engagement. But Asheron's Call really built it into the game, where The idea of these raids, these really complex raids, these really complex sort of macro events that would occur in the world. And we'll see later when we talk about some of the games that happened in the 2000s, these became very important re-engagement mechanisms and were almost the equivalent of sequels, if you will, where we now think of seasons when we think of some of these long-duration online games where you're in season X of Fortnite or season Y of League of Legends, etc. Really, the early antecedents to that were these events, essentially, in the early MMOs.
Eventfulness, in my mind, is actually just like live operations. And the best multiplayer free-to-play games have really become live operation games, meaning that they're constantly thinking about how do we keep this fresh? How do we introduce or how do we balance these things to make sure that the game is staying eventful and making you so you come back? So it is just almost another retention or engagement tool to keep it so people are finding ways to come back.
It's very true.
So we've talked a lot about MMOs so far. From my vantage point, we actually don't see MMOs talked about that much today in the modern games industry. What happened? Did they just disappear or did other genres start to form?
So in parallel to the emergence of the MMO, there was the rise of another form of gameplay in this multiplayer forever game genre, for lack of a better term. And I would describe that as the session-based game. Now, the session-based games crossed a variety of different kinds of play patterns. There were some strategy games, there were some shooters, etc. But basically, they all had the same bone structure, which is they could be played by 2 to 8 players to a conclusion or a victory condition, usually in less than 45 minutes to an hour. We've already discussed Doom in a previous episode. It was released by id in 1993 with local area network play. It popularized the idea of the deathmatch, which was the first competitive session-based gameplay pattern. Quake in 1996 kind of expanded that to play over the internet with better 3D graphics, and it became immensely popular and was kind of an early esport. You'd see these LAN parties in Texas where people would literally bring their own computers and hook into the network, and they would play these big competitive tournaments. And then id decided to go all in, I think emboldened in some way by the success of those LAN parties in 1999, and published Quake 3 Arena, which I worked with them to publish at Activision. They controversially just abandoned the whole concept of a single-player gameplay. And I remember how controversial that was at the time internally. I mean, my bosses at Activision were freaked out that id wasn't going to include a single-player play experience in this, that it was going to be online only. Like, will that limit our audience, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, it turned out to be huge and really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. That same year, Epic released Unreal Tournament, which was the first-person shooter that also privileged kind of competitive multiplayer. Valve brought Counter-Strike, which was a mod that had been created by their community on top of Half-Life, and sort of relaunched it as a Valve product, as we discussed in the last episode. And again, that was an early example of this kind of session-based multiplayer product. And so like with the early MMOs, communities of enthusiasts started to form around these games on the internet, and they were hosted both online and in these real-world competitive events like the LAN parties. And so I think really that session-based multiplayer game, initially the shooters, was a really important next step in the evolution of the forever game.
Yeah, session-based games for me are like my bread and butter. I think like progression that you feel in these games actually, when I think about the early games of me playing games, I used to play, let's say, Super Smash Bros. Melee, or I would play FIFA or something like that. When you finally got to play one of these games online and play against, again, a stranger, it unlocked this whole other part of my brain, which was, competitiveness.
So yeah, I think that's right. I mean, while the MMOs probably privileged community, the session-based games really privileged competitiveness because, again, they reached a victory condition within that 45 minutes to an hour. So there was this sort of, again, sports-like component to it, which I think was really important. And they became way more popular ultimately than the MMOs could ever be. I think they were far more accessible. And not only did you see this happening in the world of the first-person shooter, but you also saw it happening in the world of the real-time strategy games. So in many ways, the real-time strategy games, despite being less popular today as a genre, were more important in these early days as session-based examples because that's what really people were playing. They were easier to play. They were more amenable in a lot of ways to online play of the day, given how the internet infrastructure existed back in the late 90s. So you had Command and Conquer from Electronic Arts in 1995. They embraced this idea so much that they actually put 2 discs in the box of the boxed product so that friends could play on a local area network without having to buy 2 copies of the game. It was that important. Ensemble in Dallas made Age of Empires. Age 2, which was published in 1999, is still being updated today by Microsoft and is still being played. As we record this podcast, the Red Bull Wololo tournament is happening in Germany, where Age 2 is still a prize money viable game 20 some odd years later. Incredible. I still play this game in its 4th incarnation today. So to our point, this persistent play pattern, this forever game, super viable and really came out of this. But perhaps one of the most important of these games came out of Blizzard, and that was StarCraft. StarCraft was launched in 1998. Not only did it become one of the most popular sort of single-player and multiplayer games in history, StarCraft goes to Korea and really creates the phenomenon that we think of today as people watching Twitch streams, people watching YouTube videos of play. Really was a StarCraft phenomenon, and so became very important to our modern concept of the video game business.
I played a lot of StarCraft, a lot of Warcraft as a kid, and it's funny to me because there's sort of this period in time where they just disappeared, and I sort of just forgot that they existed. And then it wasn't until many years later that I put it together that there was another game using that IP. But it's really strange to think about as like real-time strategy games like a Warcraft or StarCraft, what you and I were talking about before this, that they sort of just disappeared, or Blizzard almost abandoned them as IP.
Yeah, I think it's Blizzard's problem more than anything, right? Because you see what Microsoft has been able to do with the Age of Empires franchise. They literally put out a definitive edition of Age 2 recently. So they've updated the graphics of this 23-year-old game with 4K and new sound and all of these things to make it feel more modern while retaining, again, that core competitive gameplay pattern that was just so durable and so well balanced. They didn't really mess with the parts that were working. They just took all of the cosmetics and all of the online player matching, all of those components and just brought them up to 2020 standards. And in the meantime, Blizzard did not. Blizzard really left Warcraft, if you will, to Riot in order to modernize. And Riot took that ball and ran with it. But that was really a real flaw in the Blizzard strategy, was they just underinvested in some of these play patterns, which is remarkable considering that they created World of Warcraft. That was one of the most important and probably the most significant MMO in the history of MMOs. So let's talk about World of Warcraft. In 2004, as we've just discussed, there were really these 2 parallel play pattern tracks that were dominating online multiplayer play. So you had the MMO on the one hand, or the online world as it was kind of evolving into. And then on the other hand, you had these session-based games with concentrated action and competitive play. And it really seemed like the session-based games were taking over. After 2000, there was really a lull in the period after Asheron's Call where there were a few kind of unsuccessful MMOs that were published, but really it felt like the genre was kind of going to be supplanted by the session-based game as the dominant online play pattern. But in 2004, Blizzard kind of puts the MMO back at the center of the conversation. So they took the characters and the settings from their popular strategy game series Warcraft, which we discussed in this as a session-based game, right? And they repopulated them in this new MMO called World of Warcraft with stunning 3D graphics and super deep and diverse gameplay. So Blizzard's a really interesting company. While they're often held up as this shining beacon of independent creativity in the video game business, in truth, they were really only independent for like 3 years of their existence, from 1991 maybe to 1994. And after that, they were always owned by a much bigger company. First, they were owned by software publisher Davidson, then by a financial services company called CUC, then by this real estate and travel company Cendant, and finally, they became part of Vivendi, then were acquired by Activision when Vivendi and Activision merged, and now they're going to be part of Microsoft when the Activision deal closes. So they've actually rarely had to sort of experience the video game business the way a typical independent developer would experience the video game business. They've always been extremely well funded, and they've always kind of been insulated from a lot of the business realities of the video game business over their long history.
It is hilarious just because everyone does view it as this independent company for some reason. Well, I remember when we first talked about this, I was like, what? They were only independent for 3 years? Like, it sort of blew my mind because the perception and the community perception is, oh, they've always been this independent organization.
So World of Warcraft's success is really the product of just an exquisitely executed fast follow. They didn't attempt to reinvent the MMO genre. They just made the MMO into a more conventional game. They took inspiration from some of the session-based games. They brought in a higher level of graphical quality. They built better gameplay and with their quest system and their marketplace and their progression. But they also brought their characters. Like Blizzard had these popular brands from Warcraft. They had a bunch of intellectual property that was well known and beloved. And they really just mixed all this stuff up together and created this powerhouse of a product. It proved to be just a magical combination. And look, World of Warcraft is still going strong 17 years later.
I mean, they're still creating new raids. They're still updating to the eventfulness piece. They're still updating the game all the time. And you see it when they come out with a new almost expansion pack. The entire internet or all of Twitch or YouTube just completely explodes.
So the other thing I want to stress about World of Warcraft is what a great example it is of one of the 5 rules of engagement for these forever games, and that is player investment. So in World of Warcraft, the progression involved a lot of grind. You had to level up your character in order to get better gear, in order to go on more sophisticated quests, in order to accomplish more sophisticated things in the world. And as you leveled up, as you spent that time, you created really all of this equity in your character, right? There was essentially a sunk cost in your character, and that was a sunk cost in time and in money because you had to be subscribed during that period of time. And I remember just as a Warcraft player, as a World of Warcraft player, I kept a character alive for like 3 years without playing the game because I had invested so much in that character, had leveled that character up to such a high level that I felt like that there was this massive loss that would occur if I let that character lapse, if I let that character die, despite the fact that I wasn't even playing the game at the time. And so I think that is a really powerful mechanism within the game that is largely misunderstood within the video game business. I don't think people really appreciate enough what a draw that player investment is and how that unwillingness to take that loss, if you will, keeps you motivated to either be engaged in the game itself or at least to keep paying when you're not engaged because you want to maintain the progress that you've made. And that sort of avoidance of loss really has a powerful psychological impact on keeping churn low.
When you look at World of Warcraft or Blizzard in this case, that's probably the extreme end of player investment in that you actually can lose your character by churning, which you don't really have that in too many other games. And it's a really crazy example of how you have a really sticky subscription business. The piece that you also see, though, or what you touched on, is the reason why people are actually keeping those things alive is because of the progression in the game. And you see that a lot in other games today where simply because it was a hard game to get over the onboarding or they put in hundreds of hours, it accrues and they never actually churn. And so player investment to me is this, it's not just purely investing dollars in, it's actually just time. And there is some cost of, oh, I don't want to go and learn another game because I've already put so much time into this other game.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we're going to come back and talk about some of this in our episode on Web3 gaming, because I think it's a really interesting argument for the Web3 concept of being able to own your character and take that character with you. Now, again, there's an enormous amount of complexity involved in that notion, and it's much easier said than done. But nevertheless, there is some kind of logic to the idea that, you know, all of that sweat equity that you put into that character is something that you should own as a player.
Yeah. And World of Warcraft is actually probably the first example of a forever game, of an online multiplayer forever game. Is that fair to say?
I don't know. I mean, I think UO certainly would qualify, right? I mean, you know, UO's still going strong 25 years later, but I think in terms of scale, I mean, UO never really got beyond a couple 100,000 players. Like, if you really want to look at something that achieved meaningful scale globally, despite its influence, the UO's influence, it was really World of Warcraft.
It's super interesting, though, because they achieved this status still as a subscription product. And you and I both know that free-to-play is really when this all starts to become unlocked. Like, so what happens next?
It took a couple of years, but by like 2008, World of Warcraft was really dominating the online gaming space. The social networking games were just taking off in the US and Europe, like we discussed in the last episode. Apple hadn't yet launched the in-app purchase for the iPhone, so free-to-play and virtual goods were still mainly happening in the Korean and the Chinese markets. So probably the next most significant thing came out of Asia during that period, and that was free-to-play games like Cartrider from Nexon. That had launched a couple of years earlier in 2005 and was starting to be a phenomenon at this point. I was really fascinated by this game at the time. I gave a couple of talks back in that period where I pointed people at Cartrider and said, keep an eye on this thing because it's going to be really significant. It took that session-based play pattern, which was the race in this case, and it added a sort of a cartoonish console gameplay pattern and virtual goods with cosmetics and decorative items, little status markers that you could highlight your character and your cart within the game. And it proved that you could give 100% of the session-based gameplay away for free and still make a ton of money and have a great business. So with that as kind of the backdrop, with that as my prepared mind, really the next most significant thing in this space happened in November of 2007. And that was when I got introduced to an LA startup that wanted to pitch me a new game. So I was doing my prep before the meeting. I was looking at their materials and, it just seemed kind of like a non-starter for me as an early stage game investment. From what I could see on paper, it had a lot of attributes that I would usually consider to be red flags in a video game investment at the time. I mean, first, the founders, while they were gamers, they had no real game production experience at all. And a lot of their previous work experience wasn't particularly relevant to the games industry. And I have to say I'm very sensitive about that. The video game business, and I've gotten less this way since I've gotten older, but like at the time, I was just coming off of a period where I had been working as an operator in the video game industry, and the video game business is kind of tribal, for lack of a better word. And I think that tribal nature makes the video game business very suspicious of tourists. And this had a whiff of tourism about it. So I think that was initially a little bit of a flag for me. Look, making really good games, as we know, is incredibly difficult. And inexperience in this regard, both at the founder level and also at the team level. In this case, the team that they had assembled, while there were some experienced people on the team as a unit had never made a game before. And again, that's something where I had experience as a publisher, having seen companies like this struggle, because the workflow, working out all of those relationships between the art department, between design, between technology, is something that really takes reps. And it really requires a level of integration, because without it, you end up missing deadlines, you end up missing budgets. There's a lot of downside to a first-time team. So with all of that as the background, I showed up at their office and sat down for the meeting. And within 15 minutes, I was completely blown away. This company answered every single question I had about any of these red flags, about any of their market opportunity, about any of their creative chops. And 15 minutes into the meeting, I literally looked down at my pad of paper and I was like, I'm going to fund this company. And that company was Riot Games. And the product that they were pitching me was League of Legends.
Were you thinking about it from, this is business model innovation? Obviously, they were inspired by the Warcraft mod of Dota. Was that a factor in this, of maybe there wasn't as much gameplay risk? How were you thinking about it?
I think there were a couple things involved in it. I mean, first of all, the founders, Brandon Beck and Mark Merrill, were just incredibly compelling. They had experience in some very hardcore aspects of the games business, more as kind of players and community organizers than as creators, but nevertheless, they really got it. They felt like the kind of people that you could appreciate wanting to make something great. And I think that gave me a lot of confidence on the one hand. I think their business model was something that obviously we'd seen in Asia. And so we were looking for things in the United States that could potentially utilize this Asian model, if you will. And this was one of the first things we had seen that really had a sophisticated approach to that kind of Asian model. And then I think the third thing that is kind of misunderstood about their initial pitch was it had one of the most sophisticated go-to-market proposals that we'd ever seen.
And I think I know the answer to this question, but at the beginning of this episode, we talk a little bit about lifetime value and how difficult it is to calculate that or even factor in that. How do you think about this reaching venture scale? Or like, oh, well, let's just assume that on the free-to-play side, they're going to monetize and they'll reach scale eventually. How were you thinking about it?
You know, it's difficult to make those kinds of calculations at that initial phase. And I would be lying if I said that there was some kind of a formula that we could utilize that would give us any confidence. In some ways, it was really a gut feel. Here we had compelling founders. We had a market opportunity for a game that we felt could scale to the millions of users. And we had a virtual goods-based free-to-play model that we had seen scale from a revenue perspective in other markets. And we looked at that sort of grouping of factors and said, you know what, there's enough here that justifies an early-stage investment. It was nothing more than that. There were no metrics. There was no way you could point to anything quantitative and say, oh, look, this thing has momentum. It was a wireframe. This game was barely even playable at the time that we invested. So again, you don't have the same kinds of sophisticated metrics that you can look to that we had when we made investments in things like Instagram or in Snapchat, where we had way more data.
It's incredible to hear this just because it's one thing for you to talk about it and say, like, here was our investment thesis. But the other aspect of this is that you actually did it. Like, you actually put your money where your mouth was. And you were right. You and I both know that Riot today is a massive, massive company. But maybe just for context, like we highlight just how successful League of Legends actually was.
Yeah, I mean, it took a while. It took a few months before you could really start to see that it was working. But once they had enough characters, once they had enough gameplay worked out, they had the balance issues fixed a little bit, and they started to recognize what the initial early hooks for monetization were. And they changed. Initially, for example, there was a lot of traffic and purchase of things like grind enhancers. So you could buy these spells that would allow you to play for an hour and get 4 hours of credit in terms of your experience points and your grind. And so those were really interesting initial early signs. But as the player base started to level up and started to develop, new things started to become more popular. New characters, actually some cosmetic elements for the characters started to become very popular. I was actually quite dubious of the idea that you could sell Christmas-themed costumes, for example, for characters in this super hardcore game. And yet it worked. I was totally wrong. The Christmas and the Halloween-themed costumes worked really well. And so, it took a bit of evolution. And with these games, I think with free-to-play games in general, with these next-gen monetization mods, it's really important to build in enough time to start to see what the emergent behavior is and to be able to lean into the things that are working and lean away from the things that aren't. I think too many game developers feel like they're smarter than their audience and they commit too early to a monetization strategy, and it kind of doesn't work out. But I think the League of Legends management team was clever enough to understand that they had to be nimble, and they were. And as I said, over time, what was working in the game changed.
It's absolutely incredible. And every time we talk about this, my mind sort of explodes because it's just so incredible how well this played out. As we're talking through these 5 traits of a forever game, it feels like Riot and League of Legends are actually the perfect example of what you should be in each of these. They're incredibly balanced. They're amazing at community. The player investment piece, all of these aspects, they have just perfected. And it's amazing because we're now, 12 years later or 13 years later of when they released League of Legends, and you actually now have Valorant and you have Teamfight Tactics. And these are additional games from Riot that also just continue to learn or built off of their best practices of League of Legends.
Yeah, and I think Valorant is an interesting example, right, of that playbook. They're leveraging all of the things they know how to do really well, but they're not reinventing the wheel. The play pattern for Valorant is not something boldly innovative. It's something we've kind of seen before. They just execute it really well, and they know how to monetize it. They have a community, and now they have their own community. It's not like we have to now dig the little trench and sort of siphon off the community from Dota that we had to do back when we launched the game. At this point, they've got this massive audience that they can direct at their next product.
They've announced that they're working on a fighting game, and they've announced that they're working on an MMO. And so in some regards, Riot might actually just be the perfect studio at developing forever games.
It may be. I think there have been some other interesting companies that have sort of popped up in the wake of Riot. And I think one of the most interesting is actually not a new company, but, an existing company that has learned, they sort of drank the Kool-Aid on the Riot model and have created something new. So, League of Legends goes out and becomes profitable very quickly and starts to scale. Now has done $1 billion in revenue annually or more for, as long as I can remember. the next genre to really take that model and run with it was the first-person shooter model. There was a battle royale game that was created by a developer called PlayerUnknown, the game called Battleground, right? Or PUBG as we know it in the video game business. And PUBG was sort of the next turn of the screw here. Like they took this shooter concept, they had a really clever gameplay pattern which limited the possibility of stalemate in the game by forcing a conclusion within a particular limited amount of time. Really highly playable, really fun, and the game did really, really well. The team at Epic, who had been working in parallel with id back in the late 90s. They had released Unreal Tournament around the same time that I was publishing Quake 3 Arena. So, this is a company with deep, deep roots in the video game business, and they had been creating the Unreal Engine on which many, many successful games had been made in the intervening years. They started to work on a product for themselves called Fortnite. Interestingly, Mark Rain, their head of marketing, who's been a friend of mine for many, many years, he came to visit me in Woodside while they were in development of Fortnite, where I was living at the time. And we were sitting in my backyard drinking a beer, and he had his laptop and he was showing me the game. And frankly, what he was showing me at the time, which was kind of a tower defense game, it wasn't really the battle arena game that Fortnite would ultimately become. It was kind of bad. And I think he knew it was kind of bad. And he was like asking me, like, what can we do with this? And, I didn't really have very many good ideas, but it's really funny to think about in retrospect because oftentimes you don't get that look at a product that's under development. And to see, it always looks so deterministic. When you look at it in the rearview mirror, it's like, oh, yes, we were always making this big hit. But, Fortnite at the time he showed it to me certainly wasn't on its way to becoming a big hit. But the Epic team then learned some lessons from PUBG, and they really reconfigured Fortnite to be much more of a MOBA and much less of a tower defense game. And they released it, and it just became enormous. I mean, really, in a lot of ways, Fortnite is the successor to League of Legends in terms of really getting all of those elements of the forever game in place.
It's funny because they actually did end up releasing that tower defense game like alongside the battle royale mode.
Yeah,
and I just remember,
Save the World.
Yeah. And they quickly shuttered it after like 6 months or a year, and it's pretty remarkable because I remember I played PUBG at the time, and I remember Fortnite coming onto the scene, and Fortnite just completely took over. It was incredible.
Yeah, PUBG I think suffered from the fact that it had a much higher degree of like realism in a way. Like it felt more like a military shooter. And I think in a lot of ways, Fortnite was more cartoony. It felt a little bit friendlier. And I think that really helped in terms of broadening its audience. It had just so many of the elements in place of a great forever game, right? It was accessible. They had built it on a free-to-play basis. They had a really great virtual goods engine behind it. They were monetizing things like dance moves and other things like that. A lot of cosmetic items. People were really getting invested in the cosmetics of their characters, and they allowed for a lot of variation in that regard. And I think that helped tremendously in terms of getting people to really personalize the game to their own needs and to pay for that degree of personalization. It was super balanced. They built it, again, like League of Legends, which always only had like a limited number of maps. They had a similar kind of thing. So there were constraints, and you could play repetitively and really get good at it. And you could learn sort of like the nuances where you could hide, where you could attack, etc. And as the community grew and ultimately reached an astonishing 125 million players, there were enough people around where there was always a viable game that you could jump into. And that liquidity, that user liquidity, turns out to be really important as these games grow.
We touched on it at the beginning of this conversation, but it's Fortnite and PUBG were also sort of spun off of mods themselves, right? Arma and H1Z1 had these mods that basically created the Battle Royale genre. And then you see a game like Fortnite run with that new genre or play pattern and just completely take it to a different level because in a lot of ways they innovate on the business model. And yes, there's tons of amazing things on the design side, but the commerce and the way that they kept things as a live service, it fundamentally changed the outcome of Fortnite. And
it's a great
incredible
point. And I think it's, again, the reason we're doing this podcast is to really highlight how important that business model innovation is, that you can have sometimes the greatest game in the world, but if you pick the wrong business model for that game, you're going to limit your upside. And I think what we've seen with these games, and in particular, the subtext that you allude to, which is this prevalence of mods in the community and how important those mods were to really a lot of the innovation that occurred. So you go back and you look at Counter-Strike and ultimately CSGO being built on top of Half-Life 2. You look at Riot Games' League of Legends, which was really a mod in many ways of Warcraft 3. You look at PUBG and Arma and DayZ, which was also an Arma mod, which was very successful. It's a very interesting sort of undercurrent of the video game business that doesn't really get a lot of attention.
I think it's one of these things where Fortnite, to their credit, really did innovate a lot around the commerce model. You look at the battle passes or the cosmetics and even the events that happen, right? They threw major concerts.
Yeah, they had Travis Scott in there. Like 40 million people watched Travis Scott concert inside of Fortnite.
And they continue to innovate around the actual commerce model. And for me, when I look at that and you look at when they do events, even just events of keeping the map fresh. So that's one of the ways that they get to update the game is they actually just destroy certain parts of the map that weren't there before. They introduce new lands, and that's how they keep the game fresh. And to me, it's just so interesting to watch because it truly is a forever game.
Yep. What we've learned in this episode is that we've had these two parallel tracks of session-based games and massively multiplayer online games or virtual worlds, if you will. And they each have different attributes that made them successful. But as we've seen over time, really they borrowed from each other and they sort of traded features as they evolved. And so you ended up, now in the second decade of the 21st century with a bunch of hybrids where you have a lot of these products where they are session-based games, but with lots of attributes of MMOs or MMOs, but with lots of attributes of session-based games. And, you see these across the industry. I mean, you see them in all kinds of genres. I mean, you look at things like Destiny from Bungie, for example, or you look at Clash of Clans from Supercell, right?
Yep.
Similar kind of thing. It's like it's session-based, but it has persistence and it borrows a lot of elements from the historical MMOs. So I think very interesting to see how this has all played out. And you can imagine all kinds of interesting hybrids of this continuing to evolve into the future. We're going to look in the next episode at some products like Minecraft and Roblox, which have kind of returned to the MMO genre, but again, with certain elements. I mean, there's the survival element in Minecraft, for example, that feels a little more session-based.
Yes.
And it's going to be interesting to explore some of these topics as we continue this conversation.